Hello, and welcome to Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick. All of the hostages being held in Gaza, including those alive and dead, are about to be released. Only some of the hostages held in Israel will be released at the same time. Um, I go into this in my most recent text article on Cutting Through, and I will link to that below this video. Still, this is a much better day than any of the 2 years we've just lived through. Those of us privileged enough to have been safe and have lived through them anyway. But for the moment, the Israeli onslaught in Gaza has stopped, and there is reason to hope, though not to be certain, that this time it will hold at least until the next chapter of this ugly story of settler colonialism, apartheid, siege, genocide, and resistance is written. That means that it is time to step back and look again at some of the broader questions. And what I'd like to look at today is one I've visited many times before, and that is the question of the Israel lobby as typified by the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, and many other groups that are affiliated with it, work with it, or work parallel to it. So, in an article on Sunday, Haaretz editor-in-chief Aluf Ben discussed his analysis of the rationale behind Donald Trump's decision to force Israel to finally end its genocide in Gaza. And he roots it in I'm sorry to say, a fairly shallow historical analysis. And it's not a very detailed look, but it's not a bad analysis for all of that. He looks at other instances where the United States historically has forced Israel to stop what it was doing, to withdraw from territories, for example, in the Sinai twice that it captured, once in the 48 war, once in the 56 war. Um, Contrasting that with 1967, where its overwhelming victory and the Cold War calculus in place at that point, when Israel was starting to move much closer to the United States, uh, sort of dictated a different outcome in his view. And I think that's not incorrect, although, again, there's more to the story than that. Um, and the fact of the matter is we can see it over the years. We've seen it. It's been visible in recent years, in this century, whether it was George W. Bush, Barack Obama, even Donald Trump in his first term. Israel was ready to annex the West Bank, and although yes, um, that would have interfered with his plans for the so-called Abraham Accords, which has been a disaster, but they're there. Uh, and he used that development to help him stop Israel from annexing the West Bank at that time. So even Trump did that. Numerous episodes we saw back in 2008, 2009, when that horrific bombing of Gaza was going on. Barack Obama, just coming into office, made it clear that he did not want that happening, and Israel stopped. It's been a consistent pattern that when the United States puts its foot down, Israel listens, regardless of how far right its government has gone. Yitzhak Shamir was every bit as right wing as Benjamin Netanyahu, and he also had to listen to an American president. So, it's not a terrible analysis that Ben is making, although again, I do think there's a lot of detail that he omits. But one factor that's completely absent that you would think would be there when you're talking about American policymaking is the lobby, the Israel lobby, AIPAC, etc. He makes no mention of this. He doesn't even talk about political domestic forces, which I think is a bit of a glaring omission, but he's not wrong in that it really played very little role in the U.S. support for this genocide for 2 years. Um, one of the problems there are people who believe that absent the lobby, the United States would have a more beneficent foreign policy toward the Palestinians. And I'm sorry, I see no reason to believe that whatsoever. I've made this argument many, many times. Israel offers things to the United States. We can say, and many analysts do say, including myself, that those things are overestimated and overrated and exaggerated. But you can't deny that there is some profit um, between in the partnership between the United States and Israel. I would say that the problems Israel creates outweigh those, but that's an analysis and that's a calculus, and people's opinion on that can reasonably differ. The Palestinians, unfortunately, offer very little to the United States. The fact of the matter is that there's no government in the world that has a real stake in Palestinian freedom in terms of purely geopolitical strategic thinking. We can come up with scenarios where for this country, that country, including the United States, hell, I can tell you why Palestinian freedom would be good for Israel, at least for Israelis anyway. Maybe not for, you know, for Zionism, but for Israeli individuals, I believe Palestinian freedom would be good for them. But that's what I believe. And I think, again, that's a debatable point. I can't prove that. And I think most countries, and we've seen it, there was just a report this week that talked of how six very significant Arab states, including Qatar, Egypt, of course, Jordan, um, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and I believe Bahrain was the sixth, have been cooperating, not just doing business as usual, but cooperating with Israel militarily all through the genocide, despite the fact that they would publicly condemn Israeli actions. So, there just aren't many countries that believe it is in their interest to see the Palestinians win, and for good reason. Think back to the beginning of the Arab Spring in Tunisia and what that sparked. It sparked a belief in the Arab world that they could overthrow the dictatorships that had been, ruling them from almost time immemorial. They're the oldest dictatorships in the world. And, you know, that belief sparked uprisings all throughout the Middle East. They were violently put down. You might have noticed that the West did not seem to care very much. We certainly didn't help those people. We wrote very flowery articles and made comments and things like that, but we did nothing to help them. And eventually they were put down. Uh, if the Palestinians ever truly win their freedom, truly win their rights, I think you will see a very similar uh, um, spark go through the Arab world and the Muslim world and the global South in general that says we don't have to live under colonialist rule anymore. We don't have to play the game according to the rules of the colonizers. We can determine our own future. We can fight for this and win. And I don't think these countries want the leadership of these countries want to see that. So, there's that, in my view, has always been the primary obstacle to Palestinian freedom is that in the world, they really don't have allies. Even Iran, which I think has certainly, obviously they've supported the Palestinian armed resistance, many, many groups, not just Hamas. They have certainly been quite vocal in their support and backed it up with some actions. Um, whether there are many Palestinians who also believe that that is also self-serving, and I think it's true. Any government's actions are self-serving. Um, but again, that Iran is kind of the exception, even that proves the rule, because there aren't many other countries that are doing that. So, um, that is the basis among a much broader philosophy as to why I reject the thesis that AIPAC and the Israel lobby is so powerful that they can determine U.S. foreign policy. It's not true. Okay. It just isn't true. There are, however, many people, powerful people, who believe strongly that the alliance with Israel is an important part of U.S. imperial dynamics and maintaining the United States' position atop the world, which is changing whether they like it or not, um, slowly, gradually, but is changing. I don't think you have to look beyond American history. The United States, in matters both foreign and domestic, has a sickeningly long track record of the most brutal crimes in world history, including ones, frankly, just as bad as the iconic villains, the Nazis. We need no lobby to commit genocide. Ask the indigenous people of this continent if we needed a lobby to commit genocide. We don't need it to commit crimes of that are just as bad, even if they don't necessarily meet the strict definition of genocide, such as chattel slavery, apartheid, laying waste to entire countries from El Salvador to Vietnam, and so many in between and outside. I mean, the list of our atrocities is very long, and none of them needed an AIPAC to make them happen. My dear friend and one-time mentor Stephen Zunis makes this point all the time, and he's right. Now, I think there's also an extreme that's equally wrong. Um, that suggests that AIPAC, the Israel lobby, don't have any real effect, and to say that they are having an undue influence on U.S. policy is anti-Semitic. I mean, that is crap. Okay. First of all, AIPAC is the first ones to say that they are having an effect on U.S. policy. They will tell you this. They will make it very clear. I mean, it's in their interest to do so. Why else would people give them literally millions of dollars? People don't just throw their money away on this stuff. It's not a vanity project. Uh, they are buying political influence. There's a reason that they're doing this. But that doesn't mean that they set policy. AIPAC's main strength is in Congress, and Congress does not set foreign policy. In the case of the current genocide, and it is still current, AIPAC's activities were largely, mostly visible in media activism. And in that realm, they were considerable and they were effective. The division that we saw between what the mainstream media was reporting and how they were framing it, how they were reporting it, um, in talking about what was going on in Gaza, and how they continually uplifted the Israeli narrative, um, even when it was an obvious fabrication, and framed it as, often as self-defense, which is a whole different issue and completely false. Um, you compare that to the alternative in social media that AIPAC and all of these other groups could not influence. I mean, you can see right there how much effect they had, and it was considerable. It meant something. Um, we saw it also in Congress, but Congress, again, what did they really do? I mean, there was a lot of talk, and quite a bit of it. And daily you had a flow of this person bipartisan, flow of I love Israel stomping, but in the end, it didn't really amount to all that much. They didn't pass any laws that helped make all of this happen. Um, I mean, this was a genocide from the American point of view. Now, I'm just saying, this is not about what Israel was doing and the Israeli thinking, but from the American point of view, this was a genocide driven by the fanaticism of a Democratic president and the sociopathy of a Republican one. Okay. And it's because it was the Democrat who was the fanatic and the Republican who was the sociopath that it was the Republican, Donald Trump, who finally put a stop to it. His self-interest is what drove the decision to finally rein Israel in. And it wasn't out of sympathy for the Palestinians. I mean, to some extent, yes, it's driven by Trump's insane desire to have, and frankly, sick obsession with winning a Nobel Peace Prize he has in no way earned. Um, but it was also triggered, and very clearly so, by the Israeli attack on Qatar, who have endeared themselves through lavish gifts to Donald Trump, and with whom Donald Trump has a lot of business interests to be concerned with. And bombing Qatar was a big mistake for Netanyahu, and that triggered Trump into making this move now. I don't think there's much question about that. That's why it happened now instead of at some other time. This was driven, however, by initially Joe Biden. Joe Biden backed everything Israel said, offered no resistance. And I think, again, I know people have certain perceptions, but those of us who have worked in Washington, who have worked with policymakers, who have worked in lobbying, and that includes me for many years, um, and I continue to be in that world, we all know that whenever conflict, major conflict, relatively major conflict between Israel and Palestinian fighters has risen up and has become more intense, there's a certain point that the United States tolerates it in response to some attack on Israeli civilians because the one thing that's been consistent is that the United States values Israeli lives and does not value Palestinian ones. But for its own interests, and in order to maintain, in most cases, what is called stability, um, they rein Israel in. Happened in 2014, happened in 2018, happened in 2009, happened 2012. It happened every time Israel did one of its despicable mowing the lawn, as they like to call it, in their really, frankly, dehumanizing language. Um, every time the United States says, okay, you've gone far enough, stop now, and Israel stops. This has always been, and this has always been what Netanyahu has been best at. He pushes the envelope and pushes it and pushes it and pushes it and waits until he sees that the United States will push back. And when they do, he stops. That's been true of Netanyahu. It's been true pretty much of every Israeli prime minister since Ben Gurion. Um, Biden didn't ever push back in any real way. He stopped one shipment of arms um, as a sort of warning to Netanyahu not to, at that time to go into Rafah. Um, Netanyahu knew Biden was bluffing, called him on it, and he was right. Biden was not prepared to actually take any steps to rein Netanyahu in. Netanyahu knows better when it comes to Trump. He knows that Trump is not fanatical. He's sociopathic. He cares about his own interests, which he sees as American interests, as most wannabe dictators do. So it was a different set of circumstances, and that's why Trump was the one that reined him in. But we need to remember who Joe Biden was. Okay. And I'm sorry to have to say this about a man who was apparently just diagnosed with prostate cancer. Okay. But I have no sympathy on the man. He has so much blood on his hands and has convinced, unfortunately, millions of Americans that he is as he put it, a decent man. He is so far from a decent man. He is so far from a decent man. He is responsible for the wanton murder of babies, for the starving of civilians, for destroying an entire region, the Gaza Strip. He's responsible for all that. Almost all of the devastation that you see in Gaza happened under Biden's watch. Now, this is not in any way to defend Donald Trump. Okay, again, Trump stopped this apparently, at least for the moment, he stopped it, and that may change. But Trump put at least temporary, maybe a permanent, but at least a temporary pause to this for his own reasons and his own interests. He's no saint, and he's certainly no peacemaker. But and he's got 10 months, or well, 9 months, I suppose, worth of blood on his hands as well. Just in Gaza, just in terms of this genocide. We can talk about other issues as well. And that should not be forgotten. But I mean, the majority of what happened in Gaza happened not only on Biden's watch, but directly because of Joe Biden. Joe Biden, who promoted every lie Israel told, who blocked any sort of action against what was happening in Israel, who routinely pressed the Europeans to keep silent when they were starting to get uncomfortable and having to face protests at home um, of their own. Again, Trump did many of the same things. Biden did it for longer, and Biden did it to greater effect. And Biden did it out of pure fanaticism. As he said, he's a Zionist. He's not just a Zionist. Okay. Turns out he may not like the fact that Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir say the quiet part out loud, but he agrees with that quiet part. Whether he would admit it or not is a different matter. But his actions demonstrate his views. Joe Biden needed no AIPAC, needed no lobby. Now, some will point out, wow, look at all this, and this money that AIPAC gave to Biden. Look, first of all, AIPAC has only been giving money directly for the past couple of years, but that's technicality. We all know AIPAC directed the money from other PACs for decades. And that's fair. But there's two ways that these things work in politics. One way is, you're a political action committee. You're able to mobilize a great deal of money, especially since Citizens United, you can mobilize huge sums of money to support a candidate. And that candidate will do as you want because they want to get elected. That's one way. The other way is that the candidate already is going to do exactly what you want and is going to do it with gusto and do it with passion. And so the lobby gives a lot of money to make sure that that candidate gets into office. That's Joe Biden. The latter case is Joe Biden. Okay, Joe Biden, and this was not out of Biden's obvious senility. Okay, this was Joe Biden in the 80s. Made comments about killing Palestinian children that were so appalling. Menachem Begin rebuked him for it. Menachem Begin didn't want to hear that level of dehumanization, whatever he felt. Although, actually, I in many ways, the Israeli right, for all of their bigotry and racism, the old Israeli right, sometimes saw the Palestinians as more human than the so-called liberals and labor. And Begin was of that ilk, who understood why the view was that the Palestinians fight because it's their land, it's their home. We're going to take their home. And so they're going to fight us. That was the view of the right. The view of the left was they just don't understand how good it's going to be for them that we take their homes. So Begin was of that right-wing generation, different from Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, Netanyahu, and what we have today. But the point is, that he was still, certainly no bleeding heart. This was a man of the Israeli right. This was a man who was a wanted terrorist in 1948. He rebuked Biden. So this is who Biden was, and that's why he got AIPAC money. He didn't get AIPAC money in order to change his views. He got AIPAC money because he had those views, and AIPAC wanted him to have more and more power to express them. So you have to look at the politicians. You have to look at their backgrounds. You have to look at how they built their reputations. You can look at somebody, for example, like Chris Van Hollen, the senator from Maryland, who's my senator, thankfully. So I know a little bit. I remember when Van Hollen was in the House. Van Hollen didn't sound like this when he was in the House. Van Hollen, he wasn't exactly the most vociferous pro-Israel voice in the House of Representatives, but he was definitely, towing the party line on Israel. And then he got into the Senate and he changed. Now, I don't know the man. I can't say for certain what it was that changed him, but I do know that Van Hollen does not have real prospects of rising up much higher than his current position as the senior senator from the state of Maryland. He may, move sideways at some point into some, executive position if a friendly president gets elected or something. But, he's never going to be president. He's never going to be the Democratic Party leader in the Senate. He just doesn't have that in his future. So, I at least choose to believe, given how well he's articulated a more just, not a perfect by any means, but a more just stance, that he changed because he realized he didn't have to worry about it. So let AIPAC do whatever they want. I'm here. I have a following. I have a base. I'm not afraid of them. And so I'm going to say what I believe on this issue is right. And by the way, it's not anti-Israel. But his position, nobody, no anti-Zionist I know would call Van Hollen an anti-Zionist by any means. But he did change. And the reason he changed is because he was one of those people that took the money from the lobby in order to advance his political career, and towed the line. He was not, again, not the most vocal pro-Israel guy in the House when he was representative. He towed the line until he didn't have to anymore. So that's who Biden was. So who was Trump? Trump doesn't care about Palestinian lives. I mean, I think that's obvious. He came in there, he came into office talking about emptying out Gaza and turning it into a giant beachfront resort. He doesn't care about Palestinian lives. He doesn't care about the suffering of those people. He doesn't care what happens in Gaza. He cares about his own interests. And his own interests ended up getting threatened by Israeli overreach. And he smacked Netanyahu down hard. Don't let anybody tell you that that phone call that was made in front of the entire media with Trump holding the telephone as Netanyahu read a prepared apology to the Qatari emir. Um, I mean, that was an obvious humiliation of Netanyahu. He Netanyahu pissed him off, and this is what happens when you piss off Donald Trump. In this world. I mean, we saw he has no compunction about humiliating other world leaders. We saw what he did to Volodymyr Zelensky earlier this year when he was much more on Putin's side. Um, and he did the same to Netanyahu in a more subtle way, in a somewhat less direct way. He humiliated him there, and he took Netanyahu in those meetings, and he said, "You are now going to stop because the Qataris demand that you stop." Because they've had enough and they've seen enough of this, and you're going to stop it. It's very, it's not just my opinion, and analysts all over the world are saying that it was the bombing of Qatar that triggered all of this. So and again, no Israel lobby was necessary. There was no Israel lobby necessary to keep Trump, supporting Israel, keep Trump backing Netanyahu despite the excesses that he went to, despite the complete closure for 2 months of even the slightest trickle of aid coming in that led to the famine, the full-blown famine that people had been warning about. He didn't care, and he didn't need a lobby to push him to do it. He did it because that's who he is. And who he is also the same guy who finally put a stop to it for his own reasons, not altruistic ones. Again, right thing for the wrong reasons is still better than the wrong thing for the wrong reasons. So, again, there was no lobby necessary for any of this. And the lobby played really no role in it outside of what I described earlier in the media and in Congress. So, now Aleph Ben, in his piece, getting back to that, he believes that annual aid to Israel is next on the chopping block. And, I think that's premature. I think he's at least mistaken in the short term. I think he does not necessarily realize how complicated an issue that is, because aid to Israel, the annual military aid to Israel, is not just guaranteed by the 10-year memorandum of understanding that Obama worked out with Netanyahu at the end of Obama's second term, that is still in effect for the next 2 years. It's not just that. I think more importantly, it is that under legislation passed, I think about 13 or 15 years ago, the United States passed into law that the president must report to Congress that he has guaranteed Israel's qualitative military edge, the QME. And what that means is that we have taken on the legal responsibility to ensure that Israel can beat back any combination of Arab and Muslim armies that may attack it. So, in other words, if Israel went to war against the entire Middle East, Lebanon, Jordan, from the immediate neighbors to Iran, theoretically to Turkey, which would be a real complication since Turkey's in NATO, but we can, That's a whole other discussion. And all of these countries came together and came up with a plan, and they were going to attack and wipe out Israel. We are legally bound, not just to help Israel, but to make sure that Israel has sufficient means to fight them all off. That's how strong Israel needs to be. That's a law, and we have to get rid of that law before we can really talk about in any serious way cutting off the annual military aid. We cannot do the memorandum of understanding, which sets a certain number on military aid that will be sent to Israel every year. Yeah, and how that can be spent and the dynamics there. Yeah, we can not do that anymore, but we still have the issue of guaranteeing the QME. And just think about the fact that there was a report today in Israel Defense News that my friend Joel Shalit, who runs a great media site called the battleground.eu, check it out. It's worth looking at. He sent me an article in Israel Defense News is in Hebrew, but the article talked about a sale of new fighter jets from Russia to Iran that'll be delivered in, I think, 3 years. I think it's 2028. And how that can be a game changer. Now, uh, that would represent a significant upgrade in Iran's air resources. These are highly sophisticated planes, much more so than what Iran currently has, and that then requires an upgrade from the United States to Israel according to the law. So, this is we're seeing the potential for a real escalation, a real arms race. So we need to think about that when we talk about how to move on against U.S. military aid. Now, Ben ends his article by writing, Netanyahu has understood that the aid to Israel is now viewed as toxic in Washington's political arena among Democrats and increasingly among Republicans as well. That is the backdrop for his Sparta speech, which is when he talked about Israel becoming the new Sparta, essentially turning inward, not relying on anyone else, and devoting much of its economy to its defense industries. And his challenge will now be to decrease this aid gradually and not lose it in one fell swoop, certainly not before an election. This is one more reason for the sycophancy he will lavish on the president, even though the guest has humiliated him by stopping the war before the quote unquote total elimination of Hamas. Okay, so first of all, he's not losing the aid in one fell swoop, but certainly not before the next election, which is in a year. That's just not going to happen. It just is. There's no way. There's no way for the reasons that I outlined already. The law about QME and the fact that the memorandum of understanding runs for 2 more years. Not going to happen. So that he need not worry about. I also think Ben is somewhat overstating the toxicity of aid to Israel in Washington because, unfortunately, people have short memories. And already now, I mean, we're seeing some of these headlines. Well, now that the quote unquote war in Gaza is over, how can, for example, Europe rebuild ties with Israel? I've seen several articles about this. How can Democrats, rebuild a relationship with Israel? As if these are desirable things. Israel may have stopped the worst of the genocide in Gaza, but it's still an apartheid state. It's still a state that is denying rights to millions of Palestinians. Even its own Palestinian citizens do not have equal rights to Israeli Jews. Okay, so why is anyone in such a rush to get back into good relationships with this country? This country should be frozen out, and the advantage now, the opportunity now, is to take advantage of what Israel has done, the horrible crime Israel has committed, and freeze them out of sporting leagues, freeze them out of business deals, of trade agreements. Just freeze them out and treat them as the pariah state they are, just as we did finally did with South Africa. So I think, now, there's no question that the issue well, and there's also, before I go on, there's one other thing that Ben is overlooking, which is that there is still even among Democrats and certainly among Republicans, a strong sense that even if they don't like Netanyahu, Netanyahu is not Israel. And people, there is a belief, and it's widespread. I've seen it all over, that people believe that, Netanyahu is somehow a rogue acting against the wishes of the Israeli people. Now, it's true that in the most recent months, I think, more and more Israelis have come to demand the end of the operation in Gaza, mostly uh, as numerous Israeli political pundits have pointed out, to get the hostages back. And I think you'll see that opposition to this so-called war um, diminishes greatly if it does rev up again. Now, it's not the only reason. There's also the fact that people don't want to, people feel like it's run its course and they don't want to see Israeli soldiers risking their lives. And there is a growing and not in, at one time insignificant, now no longer insignificant number of Israelis who, yes, are appalled at what is being done to the Palestinian people in Gaza. Um, but I'd say that's still a minority. Let us remember when we talk about people like Netanyahu that the basic policy of discrimination and oppression of Palestinians is one that is the majority view, not only of the government, not only of the governing coalition, but of the opposition. Okay, the Blue and White Party, led by Benny Gantz, the Yisrael Beitenu Party, led by Avigdor Lieberman. I would argue even the Yesh Atid Party, led by Yair Lapid. All of these are groups that have no interest in ending the occupation and seeing Palestinians get their freedom and get their rights. And when you add them to the the governing coalition, you're left within the government a very small minority, and this is who people voted for. A very small minority of groups that are even ostensibly interested in a two-state solution, and even they often uh, do not necessarily see Palestinians as equal. They see it as very fair that Israel could control 78% of historic Palestine, and that they can then negotiate over the remaining 22% and what part of that would be a Palestinian state. So, I think that's a that so there that is a mistaken view, but it's a view that many Americans have, that Israel has been led astray by a corrupt prime minister, which is certainly true. But I think most American Jews and most Americans don't understand how popular the oppression of Palestinians is in Israel. Um, so I don't know how toxic the aid really is, but I do know we have an opportunity. I do know that now every group that's lobbying for Palestinian rights, whether they're doing it in protests, in organizing letters, or in direct lobbying on Capitol Hill, or in campaign financing or any other way, you have got to target the QME. It's the most important thing strategically right now. That has to be changed. That law needs to be changed. With that law changed, aid to Israel is vulnerable. When aid to Israel is vulnerable, the political support of Israel is vulnerable, and that does not destroy Israel, but it could destroy the nature of the government uh, as one where whose nature is Zionism rather than democracy. And I think that's the future, the only way. The fact of the matter is the Israelis, the millions of Israelis there are not going away. Certainly the millions of Palestinians have proven conclusively they ain't going anywhere, no matter what you do. And Israel has certainly done plenty. So, given that, and I mean, as it right now, it just seems ridiculous, the idea of them finding any way to live together. One state, two states, whatever. But if there is to be any hope, it has got to start with Israel giving up its basic discriminatory nature. So if you found this interesting, please like, subscribe, share it. If you can go to mitchellplutnik.substack.com and support this work through paid subscription or through one-time or recurring donations. And any help you can give is appreciated. This is how I make my living. So Thanks again, and I will be talking to you soon.